In the year 1536, a storm was brewing in England, and it wasn't just the weather. King Henry VIII, a man known for his temper and his many marriages, was about to shake the foundations of the church. It started with a royal decree that sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Saints' days, once celebrated with feasts and processions, were suddenly banned. Churches were ordered to provide both Latin and English Bibles so people could read the Word of God in their own language. This was a bold move, and it marked the beginning of a religious revolution. But the real shock came in 1537. A group of theologians gathered to draft a new set of doctrines, which were given provisional approval for 3 years. While these doctrines largely upheld the traditional beliefs of the medieval church, they emphasized the importance of faith in salvation and the authority of Scripture. They also condemned the use of images in worship, labeling it idolatrous. This was a clear break from the past, and it sent a message that the old ways were changing. The changes didn't stop there. In 1538, another royal injunction ordered the removal of images from churches, especially those to which offerings and pilgrimages had been made. But the most significant change was the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, these once powerful institutions were systematically closed down. This was a massive blow to the old religious order, and it sparked a rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Despite the uprising, Henry VIII remained determined to push his reforms through. However, in 1538, Henry broke off negotiations with the German princes, signaling that he had no intention of further modifying the Church's core doctrines. He reaffirmed traditional Catholic beliefs, such as transubstantiation, communion in one kind, and clerical celibacy. Denying these doctrines could now result in death, with no chance of mercy. This harsh stance led to the resignation of several reform-minded bishops, and some, like John Bale and John Hooper, fled to the continent. Robert Barnes, who had returned to England in 1531, was executed in 1540, the same year that Thomas Cromwell, a key figure in the reforms, fell from grace and met the same fate. The tension at Henry's court was palpable. In 1543, more stringent royal injunctions were issued, restricting Bible reading to the upper classes and praising the use of images. Martin Luther, the German reformer, was bitterly disappointed by Henry's actions, famously declaring Henry of England had sent his embassy, not because he wanted to become evangelical, but in order that we in Wittenberg would agree to his divorce. Henry is Pope, and the Pope is Henry in England. In late 1546, the Duke of Norfolk and his conservative allies fell from grace. The causes were trivial, but significant. Bishop Gardiner angered the king by refusing a proposed estate swap, and Norfolk's son raised suspicions of plotting against Edward's succession. This led to a regency council, dominated by those inclined toward religious change. When Edward VI, a young boy, ascended the throne in 1547, the pace of reform accelerated. The first parliament of his reign repealed all heresy and treason statutes, and a surge of publishing activity followed. Books by reformers like Luther, Bullinger, Calvin, and Tyndale flooded the market. At court, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Somerset, patronized reform-minded preachers who denounced the use of images in churches. The arrival of several leading reformers from the continent, driven by the defeat of the Schmalkaldic League, further shifted the doctrinal orientation of English Protestantism toward a reformed stance. Peter, Martyr, Vermilye, Martin Bucer, and Jan Lasky, John A. Lasco, were among those who came to England, bringing with them a wealth of knowledge and influence. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had skillfully navigated the religious conservatism of Henry VIII's later years, now saw an opportunity to transform the church. By 1549, a new Book of Common Prayer was approved by Parliament, transforming the liturgy into the vernacular and cutting the number of sacraments to 2. The traditional practices of the Mass were altered, and images were removed from churches. However, the changes were not without controversy. John Huber, a radical reformer, refused to accept the bishopric of Gloucester unless he could do so without wearing the traditional vestments and swearing his oath of office in the name of the saints. A pamphlet war ensued, but Huber eventually conformed. In 1552, a second Book of Common Prayer was issued, incorporating many of Bucer's suggestions and further distancing the Church from Roman Catholic practices. The Eucharist was now understood in a spiritual rather than a physical sense, and the liturgy was simplified. The 42 Articles, drafted by Cranmer in 1553, solidified the Church's Reformed theology, affirming predestination and rejecting the physical presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Despite these changes, the Church of England remained a unique blend of old and new. While it aligned with Reformed theology on key issues, it retained some traditional practices, such as the use of vestments in the celebration of holy days. The road to a fully Reformed church was not yet complete, but the foundation had been laid. The reign of King Edward VI, though brief, marked a significant period in the transformation of the English Church. A woodcut illustration from the 1570 edition of John Fox's Acts and Monuments captures the essence of these changes. At the top, the image shows the removal of Catholic symbols and images from churches, a process known as iconoclasm. In the lower left, King Edward is depicted presenting the Bible to his prelates, symbolizing the shift towards a more Bible-centered worship. In the lower right, the illustration shows a simplified church service with a relocated communion table and a focus on preaching the Word of God. Despite these visible changes, the structure and hierarchy of the Church remained largely unchanged. The idea of a fourfold ministry, which was popular among some reformers, did not gain traction. A committee of churchmen and lawyers attempted to revise ecclesiastical laws, but their efforts were thwarted by the Duke of Northumberland, who opposed the changes. As a result, the Church's administrative structure, including the roles of bishops and the system of diocesan courts, remained intact. Bishops continued to hold their positions, and the requirement for preachers to obtain a license from the bishop remained in place. If Edward had lived longer, he might have pushed for more extensive reforms. However, his reign was cut short by tuberculosis, and he was succeeded by his Catholic sister, Mary. Mary's reign saw a dramatic reversal of the Protestant reforms. She and her supporters, including the Duke of Northumberland, tried to block her accession, but their efforts failed. The Catholic restoration was swift and thorough. The Mass was reinstated, and altars were rebuilt in most parishes. Despite this, a small but dedicated group of Protestants refused to conform. Over 280 individuals, including prominent church leaders like Cranmer, Hooper, Latimer, and Ridley, faced martyrdom rather than renounce their faith. The majority of the population, however, seemed more willing to adapt to the new religious order. In many areas, the Mass was restored without significant resistance, and the number of new clerical ordinations increased. This suggests that while Protestantism had gained a foothold among a minority, it had not yet become the dominant faith of the English people. Many Protestants chose exile over submission to the restored Catholic worship. They established refugee churches in cities like Emden, Frankfurt, and Geneva. These communities continued to debate the nature of worship and produced a significant amount of religious literature, including works by Calvin and Boulanger. The exiles' writings often became more radical as the years passed, reflecting their growing disillusionment with the Catholic Restoration. When Mary died in 1558, her sister Elizabeth ascended to the throne. raised as a Protestant, Elizabeth was determined to reject the authority of Rome. Her initial actions as queen, such as removing the crucifix from her chapel and refusing to attend the elevation of the host, signaled her commitment to Protestantism. However, she was also cautious, seeking to create a church order that could be accepted by a broad spectrum of the population. The religious settlement of 1559, which Elizabeth oversaw, largely restored the Edwardian church order of 1552–53 with some modifications. The Second Book of Common Prayer was adopted, but its reformed character was toned down to avoid offending Catholic powers in Europe. Elizabeth proclaimed herself the supreme governor of the church, a title that acknowledged Christ as the head of the church, while asserting her authority over its administration. Elizabeth's ecclesiastical appointments reflected her commitment to Reformed theology. Many of her bishops were returning Marian exiles, and her first Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, had been a close associate of the reformer Martin Bucer. The Church's early defenses, such as John Jewel's Apology of the Church of England, were strongly Reformed in tone. The Geneva Bible, with its Calvinist annotations, and John Fox's Acts and Monuments, which celebrated Protestant martyrs, became influential texts. Over time, the theology of the English Church became increasingly Calvinist. The works of John Calvin and his followers, such as Theodore Beza, were widely read and printed. By the end of the century, Calvin's writings had become the most popular theological texts in England, surpassing those of other reformers. This shift reflected the growing influence of Geneva, a center of Reformed thought, on the English Church. Elizabeth's church, while Reformed in its theology, maintained a balance that allowed it to coexist with a diverse population. The religious settlement of 1559, with its blend of Protestant and traditional elements, set the stage for the long-lasting Anglican tradition. Despite the challenges and controversies, Elizabeth's church provided a framework that would shape English religious life for centuries to come. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the Church of England found itself in a tug-of-war between those who wanted to keep it as it was and those who wanted to make it more like the churches in places like Geneva and Scotland. Many people, including those who had fled to the continent during the reign of Queen Mary, believed that the English church could be improved from within. They thought it was already good in the most important ways, its core beliefs and worship, but they hoped it could get even better. Elizabeth herself was a bit of a mystery. She didn't often share her deepest religious beliefs, and didn't always make clear policies. This made it easier for people to hope for changes. She had advisors who were called political Calvinists, meaning they supported a more reformed church, and they often protected and encouraged those who wanted to make the church more pure. There were several times during Elizabeth's reign when people tried to push for more changes in the church. These efforts grew stronger and more organized each time. One of the main groups pushing for change was later called the Puritans, but the term Puritan is a bit tricky. It was originally a name given by their enemies to mock them, and it doesn't fully capture the diversity of their beliefs. Some Puritans wanted a simpler, more Bible-based form of worship, while others focused on moral issues like drinking and theater. Over time, their goals and methods evolved. The first big push for change came in 1563, when a group of clergy tried to get rid of things like saints' days, special clothes for priests, and kneeling during communion. They also wanted to remove organs from churches. This didn't work out, but some individual priests still made changes in their own parishes. When the Queen saw this, she ordered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, to enforce uniformity. He issued a set of rules called the Advertisements, which told everyone what they had to do. This made a lot of people angry, and some even wrote to other countries for help. The second wave of reform came in the early 1570s. This time, people focused more on how the church was organized and how it disciplined its members. Three events in 1569 to 1571 made Elizabeth more determined to strengthen Protestantism in England. The northern earls revolted, the Pope excommunicated her, and a plot to replace her with Mary Stuart was discovered. In response, Elizabeth made new laws requiring all clergymen to agree with the 39 Articles and all lay people to take communion at least once a year. Some people saw this as an opportunity to push for more changes. Two London ministers, Thomas Wilcox and John Field, wrote a pamphlet called The Admonition to Parliament. They argued that the Book of Common Prayer was flawed and needed to be fixed. They looked to France and Scotland as examples of well-reformed churches and criticized the power and wealth of bishops. They also called for a system where the church could discipline its members more effectively. Another important figure in this movement was Thomas Cartwright, a professor at Cambridge. He gave lectures on the early church, suggesting that the current structure of the Church of England was not biblical. He lost his job for these ideas and went to Geneva, where he learned more about how the church there was organized. When he returned to England, he wrote books that laid out a new system for the church, which later became known as Presbyterianism. This system emphasized the equality of all ministers and a hierarchy of church councils. The controversy continued, and some people were punished for their views. John Field and Thomas Wilcox were put in prison, and Cartwright had to flee to the continent again. Despite this, the movement for reform didn't go away. In 1575, a reform-minded bishop named Edmund Grindal became the Archbishop of Canterbury. Some people, like Robert Brown, decided to break away from the church entirely, forming their own congregation. Others, like Cartwright, tried to convince them to stay and work for change from within. In some parts of the country, groups of ministers met to discuss important issues and how to improve the church. These meetings, called prophesyings, were modeled on similar gatherings in Zurich. When Elizabeth heard about them, she ordered Grindal to stop them, but he refused, saying they were biblical. This led to his downfall, but many of the meetings continued anyway. The struggle for a more reformed church in England was complex and ongoing. It involved debates, writings, and sometimes punishment, but it also showed how deeply people cared about their faith and their church. The fight for the shape of the Church of England grew even more intense after Archbishop Grindal died in 1583. He was replaced by William Whitgift, a man who had very different ideas. Whitgift believed that the Church of England was already perfect and didn't need any changes. He thought that the English Church was just as good as the Reformed churches in other countries, even if it looked a bit different. He was also very worried about people who wanted to change things like the Presbyterians, and he thought that keeping the church's hierarchy was important for keeping the country stable. Whitgift and his supporters believed that the church should be run the same way as the government. This meant that the church needed bishops, just like the country needed kings. They even had a saying, "No bishop, no king." To make sure everyone followed the rules, Whitgift made the clergy swear that they would use the prayer book and that it was in line with the Bible. By the early 1580s, some ministers who wanted to change the church started meeting to discuss how to make it better. They even talked to some Scottish ministers who had been forced to leave Scotland because they wanted changes there too. These meetings made the ministers more determined to push for changes in the Church of England. In 1584, some of these ministers tried to get Parliament to pass a law that would change the prayer book and the way the church was run. They wanted to use the Genevan liturgy and create a system where local churches would have more control. But this plan didn't get much support in Parliament and failed. After this, some of the ministers decided to write a new set of rules for the church, called the Book of Discipline. They hoped this would help them change the church from the inside. They sent it to different groups of ministers to get their support, but most of them didn't agree with it. A few groups did accept it and started calling themselves classes or synods, but they were in the minority. As the years went on, the ministers who wanted changes became more frustrated. In 1588, someone wrote a series of angry pamphlets called the Martin Marprelate Tracts. These pamphlets attacked the bishops and called them names like vipers and scorpions. The same year, the Spanish Armada was defeated, which meant the church hierarchy could focus on dealing with the people who wanted changes. The death of some important supporters of the changes, like John Field, made things even harder. The new Archbishop, Richard Bancroft, started a crackdown on the ministers who wanted changes. He had some of them arrested and put on trial. The clerical conferences were broken up, and a few ministers left the church to form their own separate groups. Some of these separatists were arrested in 1593, and two of their leaders, John Greenwood and Henry Barrow, were executed. Others went to the Netherlands to find safety. These groups would later become the Pilgrims, who sailed to America, and the first English Baptists. The fight over the shape of the church also led to new ideas about how the church should be run. Some people, like John Bridges, started arguing that the idea of bishops had come from the early Christian church and was therefore divinely ordained. This idea became known as Jure Divino Episcopalianism. Another important figure, Richard Hooker, wrote a book called Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. In this book, he argued that the church's practices, like those in the prayer book, were important and should be kept. He believed that these practices were not just neutral things, but actually helped people worship God better. This idea helped create what we now call Anglicanism. Even though the attempts to change the church failed, they had a big impact. The Church of England remained different from other Reformed churches, and it started to develop its own unique identity. By the 1590s, it was clear that the church wouldn't change much during Queen Elizabeth's reign. But the debates and changes that had happened earlier would continue to shape the church and the country for years to come. As you move east from the Holy Roman Empire, the land becomes less crowded, and the nobles have more power. In the big countries of Hungary and Poland, Lithuania, the kings didn't have as much control as the kings in the West. This meant that the nobles had more say in how things were run, and the kings often had to make deals with them to stay in power. These countries were also more connected to the rest of Europe than you might think. They traded a lot with Germany and the Low Countries, and many of the cities had German merchants and burghers. Italian artists and thinkers also came to the courts of these countries. Because of these connections, new religious ideas spread quickly. In the 1540s, these new ideas started changing how people worshipped in parts of Hungary and Poland. The kings and bishops tried to stop this, but the nobles resisted because they saw it as a way to protect their own rights. In Poland, this led to the government allowing different religions to coexist. In Hungary, the Catholic Church was already weak because of a big defeat by the Ottoman Empire in 1526. This made it easier for new religious ideas to spread. By the end of the century, most of the political elite in Hungary were Protestant. The way the Reformation happened in these countries was different from other places. It wasn't as violent as in France or Scotland, and it wasn't controlled by the government like in England. Instead, it was often supported by the powerful nobles. In both Poland and Hungary, The first people to embrace the new ideas were often German-speaking burghers, and they usually followed Lutheranism. But as the ideas spread to other parts of the population, especially the Slavic and Hungarian speakers, they tended to follow Reformed ideas more. Historians think this might be because Reformed ideas appealed to people who had a humanist or Melanchthonian education. But it's hard to say for sure why Reformed ideas became more popular. In Poland-Lithuania, the country was very diverse, with different regions and languages. By the end of the Middle Ages, it was one of the most diverse places in Europe. In 1569, the Union of Lublin brought Poland and Lithuania closer together, creating a more unified country. This union would play a big role in how the Reformation played out in the region. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a vast and diverse land, was a tapestry of different regions, each with its own unique character and history. One of these regions, Royal Prussia, was the smallest, but also the most urbanized and connected to Western Europe. This region, which included cities like Danzig, modern Gdansk, Elbing, Elblag, and Thorn, had a rich history. It was once under the control of the Teutonic Knights, but was taken over in 1454. These cities were bustling with trade, especially in grain, and were home to a mix of Germans, Poles, and other Europeans. Danzig, the largest and most prosperous city, had a population that grew from about 30,000 in the late 1400s to 50,000 by the late 1500s. It was a hub of luxury goods and a melting pot of cultures. The Kingdom of Poland, the heart of the Commonwealth, was evolving into a nobleman's paradise. By the end of the 1500s, there were nearly 900 towns with urban privileges, but most were small farming communities. Only a few, like Krakow, Poznan, and Lublin, had significant populations and were centers of trade and culture. These cities had a mix of Polish, German, Italian, and Scottish residents, bringing a broader world perspective to the region. However, the nobility, who made up about 8 to 10% of the population, held most of the power and were fiercely protective of their privileges. Many of these nobles sought higher education abroad, especially in places like Wittenberg, where they were exposed to new ideas, including those of the Protestant Reformation. Lithuania, the largest but least densely populated part of the Commonwealth, was a land of forests and bogs. It was the last region in Europe to convert to Christianity, with its pagan kings only converting in 1385. By the early 1500s, Christianization was still superficial, and many people in the countryside continued to practice paganism. The region was also home to Orthodox Christians, who used the Cyrillic alphabet and were loyal to the Patriarch in Moscow. Despite its lack of urbanization and low literacy rates, Lithuania was undergoing a gradual Polonization, especially among the nobility. This change opened the region to Western cultural and educational influences, which would later play a role in the spread of Protestant ideas. The Reformation began to take hold in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 1520s, particularly in the Baltic region, which had close trade links with Germany. King Sigismund I, however, was not tolerant of these new ideas. He banned the import of Luther's writings in 1520 and imposed harsh penalties, including death, for anyone who adopted or spread Lutheran beliefs. Despite these measures, evangelical sentiment grew, especially in Danzig, where supporters managed to secure a church for evangelical preaching in 1522. In 1525, a popular uprising in Danzig overthrew the city council and closed the monasteries. King Sigismund I himself had to intervene to restore order. The spread of Protestant ideas was initially limited to the German-speaking burghers in the towns, but by the 1540s, it began to reach Polish speakers as well. One of the first known Polish evangelicals was Jacob Ilza, a teacher at the University of Krakow who fled the country in 1534 to avoid renouncing his beliefs. In 1544, Jan Seklukajan, a German-born preacher, began publishing the first Polish-language evangelical works from a press in Königsberg. These included satires against the clergy, a catechism, hymns, and a translation of the Bible. A significant evangelical circle also formed in Krakow around Francis Lismanino, a Franciscan friar, and Felix Krusiger, a Krakow graduate who resigned from his church position due to his disagreements with the Roman Catholic Church. Krusiger's journey to Calvinism is a notable story. When summoned to the bishop's court on heresy charges, he was asked if he followed Calvin's views. This was the first time he had heard of Calvin, but he obtained Calvin's works and became a follower. By the mid-1540s, Swiss theologians were beginning to influence Polish evangelicals, and Calvin himself received his first letter from a Polish correspondent in 1549. The spread of Protestantism was often supported by noblemen who provided shelter and protection to evangelical clerics. In Krakow, the wealthy merchant and city councilor Johann Bonner was a key figure in the Reformed movement. In Lithuania, Nicholas Radziwill, a powerful and Polonized noble, began to support Protestant preachers in 1553. His influence helped spread Reformed ideas in the region. Efforts to organize the growing Protestant movement began in 1550 when Francisco Stancaro, an Italian Hebraist, established a new order for the church on the estate of Nicholas Olesnicki in Pinizo. This order, based on the principles of the Cologne Reformation, became a model for other church foundations. In 1554, the first synod of a Reformed church was held in Slomniki, near Krakow, with Felix Krusiger serving as the superintendent. The Catholic hierarchy struggled to enforce the harsh laws against heresy, especially when faced with the resistance of powerful noblemen. In 1551, a clerical synod appointed inquisitors for each diocese, but their efforts often met with armed resistance from the nobility. In 1554, 3 burghers of Poznan were sentenced to death for heresy, but they were freed by a group of armed nobles. This incident highlighted the nobility's commitment to protecting their privileges and the limits of the Church's authority. The Sejm, the Commonwealth's legislative body, became a battleground for these issues. In 1555 and again in 1562-63, the Sejm suspended ecclesiastical jurisdiction over laymen, further weakening the Church's ability to punish heretics. This period of religious turmoil and political resistance laid the groundwork for the unique religious landscape of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where a spirit of tolerance and diversity began to take root. In 1557, a significant change was made in Poland regarding religious freedom. The royal towns, which were not as influential as the gentry, were excluded from the permission to establish Protestant churches. This decision was made because the crown believed that these towns lacked the freedom and dignity of the gentry. As a result, the crown ordered local officials to act against Protestants in these towns, but some officials who were sympathetic to the Protestant movement refused to comply. Despite this, the Protestant movement continued to grow, especially in the predominantly Lutheran towns of Royal Prussia. These towns, like Danzig, ensured their religious rights by paying large sums of money to the royal treasury. For example, Danzig paid 30,000 florins and provided a loan of 70,000 florins to secure recognition of their right to shape religious life as they saw fit. Similarly, in 1562, the leading Protestant magnates in Lithuania secured similar privileges for the churches in the royal towns of the Grand Duchy in exchange for their support in a campaign against Muscovy. By the mid-1550s, the Polish nobility had won the right to modify religious practices on their own lands. This freedom culminated in the Warsaw Confederation of 1573, a document that aimed to prevent religious strife. Henry of Valois, the newly elected king, was suspected of involvement in the St. Bartholomew's massacre, and the Confederation was designed to ensure that he would not bring religious conflict to Poland. The document pledged that the nobility would not use violence or penalties against each other for differences in faith, and would oppose anyone who tried to do so. However, the Confederation did not extend these protections to the towns or commoners, leading to debates that continued for years. The Polish Reformation, unlike in other countries, did not produce many martyrs. The only known execution for religious reasons was that of an 80-year-old woman who converted to Judaism and denied the divinity of Christ. Despite this, Protestant histories often claimed her as a martyr, and a book depicting the Roman Catholic Church as bloody and tyrannical was published in 1567, even though Poland had few such examples. King Sigismund II, who ruled from 1548, was known to have read Protestant literature and had connections with evangelicals like Lismanino. In 1554, Lismanino broke with the Catholic Church and married while in Geneva, encouraging John Calvin to write to the king about church reform. The Sejm of Piotrkow in 1555 suspended the authority of bishops over laymen and declared the king's ultimate authority in religious matters. The Sejm also called for a national council to discuss reforms, including a vernacular liturgy, communion in both kinds, and clerical marriage. The king, however, delayed the council and never changed his faith, fearing the consequences. John A. Lasko, a prominent reformer, was invited to Poland and arrived in 1556. He introduced institutions typical of Reformed churches, such as the election of lay elders from the nobility and the practice of excommunication. He also led the first General Synod of the Polish-Lithuanian churches in 1557 and restructured schools along the lines of those in Geneva. Lasko resisted codifying the church's doctrine, believing the Bible was sufficient. His efforts helped the Reformed cause gain ground, but the movement faced challenges including schisms and the spread of anti-Trinitarianism, which denied the traditional doctrine of the Trinity, became a significant issue. Prominent figures like Francis Stancaro and Giorgio Biandrata promoted these views, leading to divisions within the Reformed Church. Lasko and other leaders tried to combat these ideas, but after Lasko's death in 1560, the anti-Trinitarian movement gained momentum. By 1565, the anti-Trinitarians formed their own synod, known as the Minor Reformed Church of Poland, which adopted Anabaptist doctrines. The internal conflicts within the Reformed Church, combined with the revival of Catholic aggressiveness, contributed to the loss of momentum for the Protestant cause by the late 1560s. Some noblemen, dismayed by the quarrels, returned to Catholicism. The Catholic Church, led by figures like Cardinal Stanislaus Eulsius, introduced Jesuit colleges and took a more aggressive stance against Protestants. Incidents of Protestant derision of Catholic symbols, such as a nobleman disrupting a Corpus Christi procession, led to increased tensions. The alarm over anti-Trinitarian views and the rise of Catholic aggressiveness led the Polish Reformed to seek alliances with other Protestant groups. In 1565, the Reformed and Czech Brethren reached an agreement in the region of Kujavia. In Lithuania, the Reformed and Lutherans also formed an alliance. In 1570, a conference at Sandemich led to a consensus among the Reformed, Lutherans, and Czech Brethren, allowing them to discuss religious matters jointly while maintaining their own organizations and beliefs. This Sandomir consensus became a model for similar agreements in other regions, promoting cooperation among different Protestant groups. The defection of many Reformed ministers to the Minor Reformed Church prompted those who remained loyal to strengthen their ties with the Swiss Reformed. Christopher Tretius, a leader in Krakow, traveled to Geneva and Zurich for consultations and sent students to Heidelberg and Switzerland for further education. The Second Helvetic Confession, accepted by a Reformed assembly, became the basic confessional statement of the Polish Reformed churches. Treatises against anti-Trinitarianism were also sent from Zurich and Geneva to Poland, helping to solidify the Reformed position. These events shaped the religious landscape of Poland in the 16th century, leading to a complex interplay of alliances, conflicts, and reforms that would continue to influence the country for years to come. The Polish Reformation, a significant period in the history of Poland, was marked by the emergence of new religious ideas and the formation of Protestant churches. One of the key figures who documented this era was Stanisław Lipnicki, whose History of the Polish Reformation provides a detailed account of the movement. However, Lipnicki's work focuses more on the political and doctrinal aspects rather than the day-to-day life of the Reformed churches. In the late 16th century, the Reformed movement in Poland was at its peak. The Church was divided into three main provinces: Little Poland, Great Poland, and Lithuania. Each province was further divided into districts, and these districts would meet 4 times a year for synods, while the provinces held their own annual meetings. In Great and Little Poland, each province was led by a superintendent who was elected for life by lay elders. These superintendents, in turn, appointed clerical seniors to oversee the districts and conduct visitations to ensure the churches were running smoothly. There were also political elders, elected by the patrons of the churches, who watched over the conduct of ministers and congregations. The way people took communion in these churches was a matter of debate. Some synods condemned sitting at the Lord's table, considering it an Arian error, and insisted that communion should be taken either standing or kneeling. Despite these rules, recent studies have shown that in the city of Vilna, known nobles often filled the roles of elders, even though earlier guidelines suggested that elders should be drawn from the nobility. The Reformed movement in Poland was particularly strong in Little Poland, where 265 Reformed churches were established, along with about 100 anti-Trinitarian churches. In Lithuania, 229 Reformed churches were founded, often alongside German-language Lutheran churches. Great Poland, however, saw only 15 Reformed churches, with many more Lutheran and Czech Brethren churches. In Royal Prussia, Protestantism was mostly Lutheran, but small Reformed congregations did exist, especially in towns like Thorn, Danzig, and Elbing. What made Polish Protestantism unique was its elite nature. By 1570, about 1/6 of the nobility in Poland-Lithuania, excluding Royal Prussia, had embraced Protestant beliefs. Among the highest political and administrative leaders, Protestants were in the majority. For example, in the Senate of the Sejm, there were 28 Reformed, 7 Lutheran, and 1 member of the Czech Brethren compared to 25 Roman Catholics and 7 Orthodox Catholics. In regions with poor soil and fewer cities, like Mazovia, Protestantism struggled to gain a foothold. However, in areas with fertile soil and larger noble estates, Reformed churches were more numerous. In the cities, the legal status of Protestant churches was often precarious, but they managed to establish themselves in most significant towns. Except for Lwów, in Krakow, the Reformed Church had about 700 members, mostly from wealthy families, out of a total population of 25,000. In rural areas, the situation was different. Many lords who converted to Protestantism tried to compel their serfs to attend Reformed services, but this was met with resistance. Some serfs continued to attend Catholic churches, and in some cases, lords allowed them to support their own Catholic chapels. This led to situations where only the lord and his household would attend Protestant services. The Reformed movement in Poland, despite its success among the upper classes and the establishment of many churches, remained a minority faith. It lacked the broad social base needed to sustain it over the long term. This vulnerability would make it susceptible to decline in later generations. In neighboring Hungary, the Reformation unfolded under different circumstances. After the defeat of King Louis II by the Ottomans at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Hungary was divided into three regions: Habsburg-controlled Royal Hungary, Ottoman-controlled Central Hungary, and the semi-independent Transylvania. The defeat also shattered the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and many bishops and parish priests fled, leaving large areas without religious leadership. The political instability and the presence of the Ottomans created a more favorable environment for the spread of Protestant ideas. Ferdinand of Habsburg, who controlled Royal Hungary, was preoccupied with military campaigns and needed Protestant support to fight the Ottomans. The Ottoman authorities, seeking to stabilize their control, allowed evangelical preachers to operate as long as they respected Ottoman authority. This shift in power dynamics disrupted the traditional association between Catholicism and the defense of the national homeland, leading many Magyar nobles to see the Reformation as a way to purify the Church and counter the Ottoman threat. The Reformation in Hungary, like in Poland, was initially supported by the nobility and the intellectual elite. However, the unique political and social conditions in Hungary allowed it to spread more widely, especially in the regions not directly controlled by the Ottomans. This period of religious and political upheaval would shape the future of both Poland and Hungary, leaving a lasting impact on their histories. As we wrap up our journey through the story of Protestantism in Hungary, it's clear that the movement had a profound impact, shaping the religious and social landscape in ways that are still felt today. From the early days of the Reformation, when ideas spread through letters and books, to the formation of new church structures and the adoption of various Protestant beliefs, Hungary's path was unique and complex. In the decades following the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Protestant ideas began to take root, first among the nobility and in the German-speaking cities and mining towns. Evangelists like Mihaly, Sesterai, and Maditz, Devai, Barrow, played crucial roles, traveling across the kingdom to preach and organize new congregations. Despite some resistance from Christian authorities, especially in Royal Hungary and Transylvania, the movement continued to grow. The freedom to preach in Ottoman-controlled regions allowed for the establishment of over 120 new churches by the 1550s. The spread of Protestantism was not just a matter of preaching. It was also a cultural and educational movement. Noble converts supported the creation of Protestant schools, and printing presses in cities like Óvar, Kassa, and Debrecen produced numerous devotional and polemic works. These publications helped solidify the new beliefs and practices, making them more accessible to the broader population. One of the most significant changes was the transformation of the existing church structure. As the old Catholic hierarchy crumbled, new ecclesiastical districts emerged, led by elected superintendents or bishops. These districts eventually formed larger church provinces, which became the backbone of Hungarian Protestant churches. The theological influences were diverse, with Lutheran, Reformed, and even anti-Trinitarian ideas all playing a role. This diversity sometimes led to conflicts, but it also fostered a rich intellectual and spiritual environment. The Reformed movement, in particular, gained strength in the 1550s and 1560s. Debates over Eucharistic doctrine and other theological issues led to the adoption of Reformed confessions in several regions. Debrecen, often called the Calvinist Rome, became a center of Reformed thought and education, with its school eventually gaining a reputation as the Hungarian Geneva. However, the spread of Protestantism was not without its challenges. In 1599, the Habsburgs under Emperor Rudolf II launched a campaign to reassert Catholic control, leading to the confiscation of Protestant lands and churches. This provoked a rebellion led by Stephen Bocskai, which ultimately resulted in the Peace of Vienna in 1606. This treaty guaranteed religious freedom for Protestants in Royal Hungary, a significant victory for the movement. By the early 17th century, a clear majority of the Hungarian population had embraced Protestantism. The Reformed Church, with its strongholds in the mountain valleys and among the shepherds, was the largest group, followed by the Lutherans, who were concentrated in the Saxon towns of Transylvania and the German and Slovak-speaking regions. Unitarianism and Orthodoxy also had their followers, while Roman Catholicism had been reduced to a small minority primarily in Croatia. The story of Protestantism in Hungary is a tale of resilience and transformation. Despite the challenges and conflicts, the movement left an indelible mark on the country, shaping its religious, cultural, and political identity. Today, the legacy of the Reformation continues to influence the lives of many Hungarians, a testament to the enduring power of faith and the human spirit.